Some more people might trickle in. Are you hearing me all right there, Dr. Williams?
I hear you fine.
Okay. A lot of you I know, but some of you I'm meeting for the first time. I'm Dr. Ivory, Jimmy Ivory. I'm glad to invite you to this presentation. As you might or might not know, this is part of that larger colloquium series that we're doing. Ideas to get faculty, graduate students, and undergraduate students and staff together who are interested in things related to research in video games and virtual worlds and related technologies. We're very fortunate to be able to start off the series with a speaker from elsewhere. Of course, as you know, Dr. Dmitri Williams from University of Southern California. If we started to kind of outline all of his accomplishments, it wouldn't leave much time for him, so I won't spend a lot of time with it, but suffice it to say he's been influential in video game research, and video game research ranges from early research on online games and effects of violence and things like that to gender representations, sexuality, and we'll go on into some of the other things he's done lately. Like I said, won't do it justice to even try to describe the range of his research. Most of what he'll be talking about today, as you'll see, is from a substantial NSF-supported project dealing with virtual worlds. I won't even try to go any further into introducing Dr. Williams because, like I said, we'd be here all day if we got into his accomplishments. So without anything further, I'll bring him along. What we'll probably do, unless there's a technical problem, is hold off on questions and things until after, at which time you can press the button on one of those microphones and it should zoom in and be able to speak. And Dr. Williams, you've got all your folks here. I'm going to give you a classroom view. There's a few folks hiding in the corners and everybody's hiding out in the front row, so it looks a little quieter than it is, but you'll see everybody during the Q&A at the end. And so with no further delay, here's Dr. Williams.
No one's ever in the front row. I think that's universal. Well, good morning, everybody. It's still morning for me. I'm out here in Los Angeles. I'm in a lab room at the edge of the campus at USC. For me, you guys are like this little blurry thing in the corner of the screen. So I see like these little colored blobs, a green blob on the right and a little blob in red hiding in the back, but not much else. So I won't really be able to see your expressions and whatnot until you zoom in. And I actually don't mind if anybody wants to stop and ask questions in the middle. I'm going to cover a lot of different related research all at once. And basically what I'm going to be doing is giving you an overview of this bigger project and then a few sort of select findings. There are about 15 different papers in the works from this stuff. And so you're getting a real abbreviated look at things. And if there's anything that you're particularly interested in, I'm happy to dig into it either when I cover it or at the end in Q&A. So Professor Ivory asked me to shoot for about 30-40 minutes, but if you guys want to jump in halfway through, that's absolutely fine too. So this project is the Virtual Worlds Exploratorium, which is just a fancy way of saying, we needed an acronym because apparently it's better to get money when you have an acronym. The project is myself and 3 colleagues. We are spread out around the country. Professor G.A.M.E.R contractor at Northwestern is an expert in social network analysis. Professor Srivastava is at Minnesota. He heads the computer scientists we work with. You'll see it's a pretty interdisciplinary project where we have to deal with big number crunching. And Scott Poole is an expert in groups and teams and also social networks at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I was recently there. I just moved out to USC about a year and a half ago. Professor Contractor and I were both colleagues with Scott out of Illinois. So we're now a little dispersed, and we wound up doing a lot of group coordination through phone calls and video conferences like this. So we're kind of practicing what we preach. And like Professor Ivory said, this is work supported by the NSF. It's also supported by the Army Research Institute as well. Turns out they have a pretty strong interest in learning how groups work effectively. They have a few groups running around the world. So next slide, please. So I'll tell you how the project got started, what we're after, how we're doing it, some early stuff, some basic kind of low-hanging fruit type findings. I'll get into one, maybe 2 of the studies where we actually use a lot of what you'll hear our back-end data, talk about networks, and then there'll be a number of things we don't get into a lot today. We have a lot of findings about trust and problematic use and several others. So if there's something you're interested in or you think, hey, that might be an interesting area for research, feel free to bring it up. It might be something we're tackling. It might not. And then I'll get into the end. Next slide. So the way this project got started is I had done a lot of work in video games as a PhD student, and I'd always been struck by the lack of experimental methods that were floating around out there. There were a lot of survey projects, and then there were some good experiments, but they tended to be these really short-term lab-based studies, which I do and others do, and they're fine. But the limitation was always that you bring people into a lab and they do something for 20, 30 minutes, and then you're done, and at the end you try to say something bigger, and the problem is you can't really say anything bigger other than what happens after 20, 30 minutes. A lot of the researchers were saying, well, now we know what happens for people over their lifespan, or how their personality changes or their traits change. I always thought that was kind of a big leap to take from short-term studies. So I wanted to do longer-term studies. It'd be nice to match them with surveys, if you could do experiments and put the two together. And also, I didn't mention it here, but I also believe pretty strongly in combining some ethnographic work in there too, to actually talk to people. Those are a lot of components that I thought were kind of missing from the game research. But one of the big sort of missed opportunities, I thought, was the ability to take data from the games themselves. Because when we do typical research experiments, we're collecting data based on people's self-reports after the fact. So they come in, they play a game, and afterwards we say, you know, how do you feel, what's going on? But we usually don't track what they did in the game world. And if we're asking them about things they did over a long period of time, and we ask them what they did, they tend to get it wrong. Either because they don't remember correctly, this is kind of a telescoping problem, or they answer in a way that makes them feel better or makes them give an answer they think we want to hear. So when you get self-reports, which I've done and everybody continues to do, you get a little bit of noise in the data. I thought, wouldn't it be great if instead of asking them what they did, you just knew what they did? Because in fact, these are digital environments, the data are being collected somewhere. Can we get that? And this is a project where we do get those data and combine them with the other kinds. So we're using a world called EverQuest 2, which is a massively multiplayer online game. I call them MMOs for short. Longer acronyms bug me. Some basics about EQ2 is I'll call up for the rest of the presentation. It's a shade under 200,000 players. It used to be one of the bigger games until about 4 or 5 years ago, when a bunch of other games came along and blew it out of the water and got bigger. But it used to be one of the bigger ones. So now it's just kind of modest size. But you're still talking about a couple 100,000 people, which is a lot of people to do research on. The game is distributed worldwide, and it's done in parallel copies of each other. So since there isn't enough virtual room in one of these spaces, they'll make a parallel version, and so there'll be what's called a server, and you'll log into one server, and somebody else might log into another server, and you never run into each other. So you have a server that's your home, and there'll be different copies of these worlds. Some are zoned geographically, some zoned by time. It depends how the company does it. Sony, the makers of this game, zone things mostly by countries. So there are North American servers and Taiwanese servers and French servers, etc. It's a successor to EverQuest, so obviously they didn't put a whole lot of thought into renaming the title. Next slide. So here's an important issue for doing research on games, or really any media, is that when you do a study of one piece of media, can you say that your results are generalizable to other ones? So everybody in the audience would know that if we were going to do a study of television, you wouldn't take an episode of Fraggle Rock or the A-Team or The Sopranos and say, okay, now I know what television does or what television looks like. So you have an intuition based on your familiarity with the genres that, okay, we wouldn't want to generalize from this one specific thing out to a bunch of others. So there's a real question in the same way with all game research, is that you do a study of one game, to what extent does that tell you about other games? Or should you limit your claims to games that are similar in the mechanics of the way they work or the genres they're in? And the problem with games versus TV shows is there are a lot of more variables, a lot of different moving parts that make them different. It's relatively easy to say, well, one CSI looks like another CSI, because we say they're procedural crime dramas, and maybe that wouldn't be a huge stretch to NYPD Blue or something. But it's a little tougher if you have a game like, is Half-Life 2, or the results of a study of that generalizable to Fear, first-person shooter games? Well, maybe they're generalizable to an MMO. I'm not really sure. So on the screen you see two shots from MMOs, and in both cases they're groups of people attacking a big dragon. So I'm going to make the limited case that the results from this study are probably applicable to other big virtual worlds with similar conventions, in that they have small and large-scale groups which work together in similar structures with similar goals. The fundamentals are roughly the same. The titles that are in this ilk make up about 85% of the sales and the subscriptions for MMOs. So that's the case I'm making, is these results are probably generalizable to other fantasy-based MMOs in the space, which turns out to be a